There's a specific moment that changes everything, and most people walk right past it without realizing what just happened. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with signs or synchronicities. It's quieter than that. It's the moment when your mind stops searching for answers outside yourself and starts recognizing something that's been there all along, your own internal signal, finally clear enough to hear. I'm going to walk you through what that moment actually is, why it matters, and more importantly, how to recognize it when it appears in your own life. This isn't about belief systems or spiritual practices. It's about understanding how your attention works, why most of us live in constant internal contradiction, and what happens when that contradiction finally resolves. Stay with me here, because what I'm about to share completely changed how I understand clarity, decision-making, and what people have been calling alignment for centuries. Let me start with something you've probably experienced but never had words for. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to make simple decisions sometimes? Not because the decision itself is complex, but because multiple parts of you seem to want different things. One part wants security. Another part wants freedom. One voice says play it safe. Another says take the risk. And you end up paralyzed, not because you lack information, but because you're internally divided. This is what I call fragmentation. And it's not a personality flaw. It's a structural problem in how most of us process reality. Here's what's actually happening. Throughout your life, you've accumulated different frameworks for making sense of the world. Some came from your family, some from education, some from culture, media, relationships, trauma, success, failure. Each of these frameworks operates like a separate program running in the background, and they don't always agree with each other. So when you try to make a decision, you're not drawing from one coherent understanding of what matters. You're negotiating between competing authorities that were never designed to work together. This is why you can intellectually know something is good for you but emotionally resist it, or why you can want something desperately but talk yourself out of it repeatedly. The different parts aren't aligned, and the energy cost of this is massive. Most people assume they're tired because life is demanding, but a huge portion of fatigue doesn't come from what you do. It comes from the constant internal negotiation between these fragmented parts of yourself. Think of it like running multiple programs on a computer simultaneously. Each one uses processing power. Eventually, the whole system slows down, even if none of the individual programs are particularly demanding. Now, the ancient philosophical traditions understood this thousands of years ago, but they described it in symbolic language, talking about inner conflict as spiritual warfare, or fragmentation as the separation from divine wisdom. But you don't need mystical language to understand what's happening. This is a practical, observable phenomenon that affects everyone. The question is, what happens when fragmentation stops? When those competing internal voices finally align into one coherent signal? That's what I want to talk about next, because when you understand what coherence actually feels like and how to recognize it, everything changes. But before we go there, let me clarify something important. I'm not talking about eliminating complexity from your life, or making everything simple and easy. Coherence doesn't mean you stop having difficult choices or challenging emotions. It means the relationship between what you perceive, what you value, and what you do stops pulling in opposite directions. And when that internal alignment happens, even temporarily, you'll notice something strange. Decisions require less mental energy. Silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling informative. And the constant need to justify your choices to yourself begins to fade. This isn't about becoming calm or peaceful, though that might happen. It's about reducing the internal resistance that makes everything harder than it needs to be. Alright, so if fragmentation is the problem, what's the solution? Most people assume the answer is to find the right belief system, the correct framework, the perfect philosophy that finally makes sense of everything. But that's not how this works, because coherence isn't something you achieve by adding the right idea. It's what emerges when you stop interfering with your own perception. Let me explain what I mean. There's a concept that ancient wisdom traditions symbolized as Sophia, the personification of wisdom as a feminine intelligence. But I want to strip away the mystical language for a moment and talk about what this actually represents in practical terms. Sophia, in this context, isn't a deity or external force. It's the symbolic name given to your mind's natural capacity to integrate information without distortion. Think about how a child learns. They don't analyze, categorize, or compare everything to existing frameworks. They simply absorb patterns directly through experience. A child learns to walk not by studying biomechanics, but by feeling the feedback loop between intention and balance. They integrate the information somatically, through the body's own intelligence. As adults, we lose access to this direct form of learning because we've been trained to filter everything through language, interpretation, and comparison. We don't experience things directly anymore. We experience our thoughts about things. And this is where the fragmentation deepens, because interpretation is where distortion enters. Here's an example. Let's say you're in a conversation and someone criticizes your work. The direct experience is simple. Words were said, a tone was used, an emotion was triggered in your body, but immediately interpretation takes over. They don't respect me. I must have done something wrong. They're threatened by me. This means I'm not good enough. None of those interpretations are the actual experience. They're stories about the experience, shaped by past wounds, learned beliefs, and identity protection mechanisms. And once interpretation takes over, your response isn't to what actually happened. It's to the story you told yourself about what happened. This is how fragmentation perpetuates itself. You're not responding to reality, you're responding to competing narratives about reality. Now, integration is what happens when you can hold an experience without immediately translating it into a conclusion. It's the ability to notice. Something was said. I felt a reaction. That's the data. I don't need to decide what it means about me right now. This sounds simple, but it's incredibly difficult for most people because we've been conditioned to believe that if we don't interpret something immediately, we're being passive or avoidant. But there's a massive difference between avoidance and allowing space for clarity to emerge naturally. Avoidance is when you suppress the experience because it's uncomfortable. Integration is when you hold the experience without forcing it into a premature conclusion. And when you can do this, when you can sit with information without distorting it through fear, ego, or past conditioning, something remarkable happens. Insight arises organically, not as something you figure out, but as something you recognize. This is what the old traditions meant when they talked about wisdom descending or truth revealing itself. Nothing is actually descending. What's happening is that your perception has become clear enough to see what was already there, without the noise of fragmentation distorting it. And this is where the concept of Sophia becomes useful again, not as a deity to worship, but as a reminder that your mind already possesses the capacity for undistorted perception. You don't need to acquire wisdom. You need to stop interfering with the intelligence that's already operating beneath the noise. Now, I know this sounds abstract, so let me make it practical. Think about a time when you were stuck on a problem, and after you stopped trying to solve it, the answer just appeared. You weren't thinking about it. You were in the shower, or walking, or doing something completely unrelated, and suddenly, clarity. That wasn't luck, that was integration. Your mind was processing the information in the background, without the interference of your conscious effort to force a conclusion. And when the conditions were right, when your attention was relaxed enough, the insight surfaced. This is how coherence works. It's not something you force. It's something you allow by creating the internal conditions where clarity can emerge without distortion. So the question becomes, how do you create those conditions intentionally? How do you move from fragmentation to coherence, not by accident, but by design? That's what we need to talk about next. Here's where things get interesting. There's a specific moment that marks the shift from fragmentation to coherence, and it's so subtle that most people miss it entirely. It's not a mystical awakening, it's not a breakthrough realization, it's quieter than that. It's the moment when you stop waiting for external permission to trust your own perception. Let me say that again, because it's crucial. The threshold isn't crossed when you finally understand everything. It's crossed when you stop needing to understand everything before you trust yourself. This is a structural shift, not an emotional one. For most of your life, you've been conditioned to look outside yourself for validation. Does this make sense to others? Will they approve? Is there evidence? What do the experts say? What will people think? And there's nothing wrong with gathering information or considering perspectives. But when external validation becomes the primary authority for your internal experience, you lose access to your own signal. You become dependent on consensus to know what you feel, what you want, what matters. And this dependency creates a specific kind of paralysis, not because you lack clarity, but because you're waiting for someone else to confirm what you already sense. The threshold moment is when that dependency breaks, not dramatically. Not rebelliously, just quietly. You notice, I don't need permission to trust what I'm perceiving here. This doesn't mean you become arrogant or dismissive of other perspectives. It means you stop abandoning your own perception just because it doesn't match external expectations. And when this shift happens, something immediately changes in how you experience decisions. They stop feeling heavy, not because they become easier or less consequential, but because you're no longer negotiating with invisible authorities that were never actually there. You're simply responding to what you perceive, align with what you value, without the constant audit of imagined observers. This is what inner authority actually is, not dominance, not certainty, but self-permission. Permission to inhabit your own perspective without apology. Now, this threshold doesn't appear at random. It emerges when internal coherence reaches a certain level, and coherence builds gradually through small, consistent choices that most people overlook. Every time you choose honesty over performance, coherence increases. Every time you hold a boundary without over-explaining it, coherence increases. Every time you allow silence instead of filling it with unnecessary words, coherence increases. These aren't dramatic acts, they're subtle recalibrations, but they accumulate. And at a certain point, usually when you're not looking for it, the threshold appears. You'll recognize it because something will feel different, not externally, internally. Decisions that used to spiral into overthinking will resolve quickly. Situations that used to drain you emotionally will pass through without sticking. And you'll notice a strange new quality in your responses. They come from a quieter place that doesn't need to justify itself. This is the lived experience of coherence. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. You can lose access to it temporarily if you allow fragmentation to return, if you stop honoring the signal and start performing for external validation again. But the threshold itself doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to perceive through the noise. The key is recognizing it when it's present and choosing to protect the coherence that allowed it to surface in the first place. This isn't about perfection, it's about consistency, choosing alignment more often than not, honoring your perception even when it's inconvenient, allowing clarity to guide behavior instead of letting fear override it. When you do this consistently, coherence stabilizes, and when coherence stabilizes, everything I've been describing stops being a concept and starts being your lived reality. So the question is, are you willing to trust your own signal even before you have all the answers? Because that willingness, that simple internal permission, is where everything begins. Once coherence begins to stabilize, life doesn't suddenly become easy, but it does become clearer. And there's a massive difference between those two things. Clarity doesn't remove difficulty, it removes confusion. You still face hard choices, complex situations, and uncertain outcomes, but you stop adding layers of internal conflict on top of the external challenge. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine you're in a job that's secure but unfulfilling. The fragmented version of you would spend months, maybe years, cycling through the same internal arguments. I should be grateful. Other people have it worse. But I'm miserable here. Life is short. What if I leave and regret it? What if I stay and waste my potential? Round and round, exhausting, paralyzing. The coherent version doesn't skip the complexity of the decision, but the internal conversation is different. You assess, this environment no longer aligns with what I value. Staying has costs, leaving has costs. Which costs am I willing to pay? Notice the difference. The first version is negotiating with guilt, fear, and competing narratives. The second version is making a decision based on clear perception of what matters. It's not easier emotionally, but it's structurally simpler, and that simplicity creates space for action instead of endless deliberation. This is what living from coherence looks like practically. Your relationships change not because you become cold or detached, but because you stop tolerating dynamics that require you to betray your own perception to maintain them. You become less interested in explaining yourself, not because you're secretive, but because you're no longer seeking external validation for choices that are already aligned internally. Your energy stabilizes because you're no longer bleeding it through constant self-negotiation. And perhaps most noticeably, your tolerance for noise, both external and internal, drops significantly. Conversations that used to feel important now feel empty. Content that used to engage you now feels like distraction. Ambitions that used to drive you now feel like borrowed goals that were never actually yours. This can feel disorienting at first, especially if your identity has been built around those things. But it's not loss. It's clarification. You're not becoming less interested in life. You're becoming more precise about what actually matters to you versus what you've been conditioned to care about. And this precision is what allows energy to concentrate instead of scatter. Think of it like this. Fragmentation is like having 10 browser tabs open, each playing a different video. Your attention is split, your processing power is drained, and nothing gets your full focus. Coherence is like closing 9 of those tabs and giving your full attention to the one that actually matters. The content doesn't become less complex, but your relationship to it becomes more focused. Now, here's something important that most people miss. Coherence doesn't mean you stop feeling doubt, fear, or uncertainty. It means those emotions stop having automatic authority over your decisions. You can feel afraid and still move forward. You can feel uncertain and still choose direction. You can feel doubt and still trust your process. Because coherence isn't the absence of difficulty, it's the presence of integrity. Integrity here doesn't mean moral perfection, it means internal consistency, the alignment between what you perceive, what you value, and what you actually do. And when those 3 things align, even challenging situations become navigable, not because the path is clear, but because you're no longer fighting yourself while trying to move forward. This is the practical power of coherence, and it's available to anyone willing to stop fragmenting their attention, stop outsourcing their authority, and start honoring their own signal. But I want to be honest with you about something. This isn't a one-time shift, it's a practice. You will lose access to coherence sometimes. Life will get chaotic, old patterns will resurface, and you'll find yourself back in fragmentation without realizing how you got there. That's not failure. That's normal. The practice is noticing when coherence has been lost and choosing to restore it, not through force or discipline, but through honest self-assessment. Where did I abandon my own perception? Where did I start performing instead of being present? Where did I allow noise to override signal? Those questions aren't about self-criticism, they're about recalibration. And the more you practice this recalibration, the faster you recognize when coherence has slipped, and the easier it becomes to restore it. Eventually, coherence stops being something you achieve and starts being something you inhabit. Not perfectly, not constantly, but consistently enough that it becomes your baseline instead of a peak experience. And when that happens, you stop seeking answers outside yourself, not because you have all the answers, but because you trust your capacity to find them when you need them. That trust changes everything. So how do you actually practice this? How do you move from understanding coherence conceptually to living it practically? Let me give you 3 specific practices that build integration over time. First, notice when you're interpreting versus perceiving. Most of the time, you're not experiencing reality directly. You're experiencing your interpretation of reality. Someone says something. Before you even register what they said, you're already telling yourself a story about what it means. The practice is to catch yourself in that moment and ask, what actually happened here, before I added meaning to it? This creates a tiny gap between stimulus and response. And in that gap, coherence has space to operate. You're not suppressing your reaction, you're just not letting interpretation become automatic and unconscious. This sounds simple, but it's one of the most powerful practices for reducing internal distortion. Second, honor small boundaries without over-explaining them. Coherence builds through micro-decisions that most people dismiss as insignificant. Someone asks you to do something you don't want to do. Your fragmented response is to either say yes and resent it, or say no and spend 20 minutes justifying why. The coherent response is, no, that doesn't work for me. No justification, no elaborate explanation, just a clean boundary. This feels uncomfortable at first because you've been trained to believe that boundaries need to be defended, but defensiveness signals that you don't trust your own authority. When you honor a boundary without over-explaining it, you're practicing self-permission. And every time you do this, coherence strengthens. Third, let decisions rest before acting on them. When you're faced with a choice, notice the urge to decide immediately. That urgency usually isn't coming from the situation. It's coming from your discomfort with ambiguity. The practice is to allow space between recognizing a decision needs to be made and actually making it. Not avoidance, just allowing. Hold the question. Sit with the uncertainty. Let your system process the information without forcing a conclusion. You'll notice that after some time, sometimes hours, sometimes days, a clarity emerges that wasn't there when you were trying to force it. That clarity is integration happening in the background. And the more you trust that process, the less you need to force decisions prematurely. Now, these practices aren't magic. They won't transform your life overnight. But they will gradually reduce the internal interference that keeps you fragmented. And as that interference decreases, coherence has more space to stabilize. You'll start noticing the difference in small ways, A conversation that would have triggered you doesn't. A situation that would have created anxiety feels manageable. A decision that would have paralyzed you resolves quickly. These aren't dramatic shifts, they're subtle recalibrations, but they accumulate, and over time, coherence stops being something you're working toward and starts being the baseline you're operating from. That's when everything I've described moves from concept to lived experience. You're not trying to be coherent anymore. You're simply noticing when you've lost it and choosing to restore it. And that practice, that simple, consistent practice, is what transforms understanding into embodiment. This is the quiet work that no one talks about because it's not flashy or marketable, but it's the work that actually changes how you experience yourself and your life, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through steady, honest recalibration. And if you're willing to do that work, not perfectly, just consistently, everything I've shared here stops being information and starts being integration. Hashtag closing and natural CTA, 500 words. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Coherence isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a quality of attention you cultivate. It's not about having all the answers or achieving some elevated state. It's about reducing the internal contradiction that makes everything harder than it needs to be. And the beautiful thing is that you already have everything you need to begin. You don't need a new belief system, a spiritual practice, or a complete life overhaul. You just need to start noticing when you're fragmenting your attention and making small, honest choices to restore alignment. That's it. That's the work. And if you do that work consistently, even imperfectly, you'll notice something shift, not all at once, but gradually. Decisions will feel lighter, relationships will feel clearer, your energy will stabilize, and you'll find yourself operating from a quieter place that doesn't need constant reinforcement or validation. That's coherence. And once you feel it, you'll understand why I spent 40 minutes trying to put this into words, because it's the thing that changes everything without changing anything externally. It's the internal shift that makes external life workable, even when it's difficult. Now, I'm curious, where are you in this process right now? Are you in the fragmentation stage, feeling the constant internal negotiation? Are you at the threshold, sensing that something is shifting but not quite sure what? Or are you already practicing coherence and recognizing what I've described here from your own experience? Drop a comment and let me know. Not for me, for you. Because articulating where you are is part of the integration process. And if this resonated with you, if something here landed in a way that felt true, subscribe to the channel. Not because I need the numbers, but because if this perspective is useful to you, there's more where this came from. I'm creating content that explores these ideas from different angles, how coherence applies to relationships, work, creativity, and decision-making. Practical explorations, not abstract philosophy. And if you found value here, the like button helps this reach people who are looking for exactly this kind of conversation. Not motivation, not inspiration. Just honest exploration of how attention works and what happens when we stop fragmenting it. Thank you for staying with me through this. I know it was dense, but I trust that if you made it this far, something in here was worth your time. Keep practicing. Keep noticing, keep choosing alignment over noise, and I'll see you in the next one.